Hello, and welcome to the Safe at Home video series. You are viewing Becoming Trauma Informed Part 1. These videos are intended to help better prepare you in your role as a family partner when working with families alongside the Oregon Department of Human Services Child Welfare Agency. These videos are intended as a guide as you partner with the Safe at Home program, the Oregon Department of Human Services Agency, and the children, youth, and families with an open child welfare case. To request additional training in a specific area, please connect with your point of contact at Safe at Home. In this video, we will focus on trauma-informed care, the prevalence of trauma, and the families we serve. Feel free to take notes or jot down any questions or comments that you may want to follow up on at a later time. Now let's get started. Trauma-informed care. We will start with the definition of what trauma-informed care means. Trauma-informed is a program, an organization, or a system that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential pathways for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, and staff, and others involved with the system, and it responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. The University of Buffalo has a nice way of summarizing this definition to be easier to digest. A trauma-informed care approach strives to understand the whole of an individual who is seeking services. When trauma occurs, it affects an individual's sense of self, their sense of others, and their beliefs about the world. These beliefs can directly impact an individual's ability or motivation to connect with and utilize support services. A system utilizing a trauma-informed care approach realizes the direct impact that trauma can have on access to services and responds by changing policies, procedures, and practices to minimize potential barriers. A system utilizing a trauma-informed approach also integrates knowledge about trauma into all aspects of services and trains staff to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma and thus avoid any possibility of re-traumatization. There are 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. The first principle is safety. Safety is about addressing the physical and emotional safety for all people, and it's even more critical for individuals who have experienced trauma. When people do not feel safe physically or emotionally, their critical thinking skills are compromised. The second guiding principle is trustworthiness and transparency. This is key in building emotionally safe relationships with families, staff, and communities. When people don't feel like they can trust one another or trust you, the environment for building a strong relationship starts out very rocky, and people will not feel safe. Safety is a core tenet to a trauma-informed approach. The next principle is peer support. Peer support is allowing individuals to support one another from their own journey and helping them understand and create hope for growth and change. Often, peer support is provided from an individual with a shared lived experience as the individual that they are supporting. Now we move on to the principle of mutual collaboration. This is about partnership. This principle promotes trust, safety, and a sense of empowerment. But this is especially important for those who have experienced trauma. When provided with opportunities to work together, build mutual trust, and solve problems, we see individuals willing to engage in growth and change. Empowerment, voice, and choice is the next principle. People who experience trauma often feel like they have had a loss of power, a loss of voice, and a loss of choice. So allowing them to regain their voice and regain their decision-making skills really empowers them in their journey to becoming healthier and to heal. All this feeds into cultural, historical, and gender issues, which we will talk about in a little bit. But this really comes down to equity and helping to confront biases to be responsive to various cultures, being able to understand historical context, and really make sure we create equitable approaches as we move into being more trauma-informed. At this point, you might be asking, why would this be important to my role? Well, one of the things that research has shown us is that trauma is pervasive. Trauma impacts at least 2/3 of all individuals, which is about 66% of the population. We actually suspect that this percentage is higher than 66%, but we don't have the data to validate that theory. It's important to note that trauma affects people everywhere, not just families with child welfare involvement. But for the purpose of this training, you will be supporting the children, youth, and families involved in the child welfare system. So think of them as your audience. The impact of trauma is very broad, deep, and life-changing, life-shaping. Trauma changes the way we view the world. Trauma impacts individuals who are in more vulnerable populations in a different way. Knowing that individuals who experience a disability or adversity or mental health challenges, knowing they are more greatly impacted. We can see a ripple effect when individuals approach services, or maybe they don't approach services because they've had experiences with those service systems that have been traumatic. And sometimes service systems have inadvertently re-traumatized families and individuals. And so it can be harder to be engaged in services when you've had a negative experience. We have talked a little bit about what trauma-informed is. Now let's take a moment to understand what trauma means. The definition of trauma is typically defined as an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. Let's break this down a little bit. As we go about our daily lives, one of the most important jobs of our brain is to protect us and keep us safe. When we are put into a situation where our brain perceives that there is compromised safety and where we may encounter a life or death situation, our brain takes over and sends signals to our body that create automatic responses to the situation. This could include running away, seeking shelter, fighting, or the inability to move. At this time, our brain is not thinking about anything other than how to keep us safe, and all of its energy is focused on protecting us. Trauma can be a single event, yet more often it happens through multiple events over time. Interpersonal violence, or a violation that happens at the hands of an authority figure, is especially damaging. Let's run through a few dynamics related to authority figures. Think about the relationship between a parent and a child, or a doctor and a patient, or a police officer and a civilian, or a teacher and a student, or a caregiver and a child. Interpersonal violence can happen within any of these dynamics and can disrupt trust and can be very confusing to the individual the violence is directed towards. Trauma can also be structural. It can happen within organizations when we're not paying attention to policies, practices, and procedures. It can also be collective, historical, or generational. Collective trauma is something that a very large group of people might experience. For instance, COVID has been a collective trauma. It has been a worldwide experience. Historical trauma can be seen in racism, discrimination, segregation, and oppression. This becomes historical trauma, and these experiences happen through multiple events over long periods of time to certain populations of people. When we see this cumulatively and multi-generationally, emotional and physiological injury to certain individuals and communities can be created. And generational is where we see certain traumas get passed down from one generation to another generation. And this can happen when we fail to address trauma at a structural level. What you see on the screen is not an exhaustive list of types of trauma. There are lots of experiences that can be traumatic, But thinking about this at a high level, we know that abuse, neglect, war, assault, including sexual assault and sexual abuse, domestic violence, witnessing violence, racism, Islamophobia, gender violence, hate crimes, and even unexplained sudden death of someone we love dearly, these are all considered types of trauma. The tree on the screen also outlines something called a pair of ACEs. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. The pair of ACEs refers to experiences and environments. You can see the top of the tree outlines different experiences that are known to cause trauma, and the bottom, where the roots are different environments that can contribute to the occurrence of trauma. When we think about trauma and we think about how that can shape different people, sometimes in our heads we say to ourselves, well, I know someone who's been through something traumatic, but they've turned out just fine. You might also think about someone who's been through something similar, and yet they had a very different outcome. That is where this idea of the 3 E's of trauma come in. We look at events, experiences, and effects. So let's take an event such as divorce, which is pretty common, impacting about half the population. Let's take the event of divorce and think about 2 different experiences that could be had. First, you could have parents that are very amicable as they are splitting up and agree to co-parent peacefully. And they're really purposely trying to minimize the impact of the experience of the divorce on their children. They may have other individuals in their children's lives that are also very supportive and help walk them through the scenario and what is happening to them. Now let's consider a second scenario. In this scenario, we have parents who can't hardly stand to be in the same room with each other. Maybe there's been violence that has occurred between the parents. Maybe the family has been taught to keep things a secret and not talk about what happens at home. Children feel very isolated, like there's nobody to talk to within this scenario. Each of these scenarios are going to create different effects. While it may be a shared experience between these scenarios, the effect is very different, leading to vastly different impacts. Trauma is a deeply personal experience, and depending on your support and who has been able to help you through that or not, can really impact the effect of these experiences. Let's summarize how being trauma-informed impacts your role as a family partner. First, let's start with what being trauma-informed does not mean. It does not mean excusing or permitting or justifying negative and harmful behavior or just letting people off the hook. It actually means we do hold people accountable, but that we do this in a firm, kind, and compassionate way. Being trauma-informed does mean that we provide therapeutic interventions. It doesn't mean that we're providing therapeutic interventions if you haven't been trained in them. It's not giving advice or trying to play the role of a mental health therapist, but rather encouraging individuals to access those support or take key issues to the appropriate people in their lives. It doesn't mean focusing on the negative. It's important to adhere to the safety plan and be aware of the issues at hand, as well as celebrating the wins of the family and empowering them to do their best. And lastly, being trauma-informed does not mean that we need to know the full history of the families and individuals that we work with. You might learn pieces of the story, but in your role, you will be told the critical pieces that will help you in relation to the safety plan for the family. There may be other history that you don't learn or don't know, and that's okay. Remember, Being a trauma-informed family partner means you're engaging with the families and children in compassionate and empathetic ways, that you're recognizing the strengths and focusing on building skills. And it means you're approaching behaviors and interactions from a curious mindset, not a judging mindset. We want to ask, why is this behavior happening? What might have happened to them that led them to respond this way? This helps you keep your judgment at bay as you work to support families. The prevalence of trauma. Next, we will discuss the prevalence of trauma. These are some facts from the 2021 Child Welfare Department of Human Services data book. The first 4 bullets of this data helps us understand the volume or the number of reports that come into Child Protective Services, which we can see is quite large. Once these reports go through a screening process, it is determined which families qualify to be served in the Oregon Department of Human Services Child Welfare System versus supports elsewhere in their community. This process is more fully discussed in a previous video. In bullet 5, we can see in this data from 2021 that 41.5% of victims involved in cases were 5 years old and younger. In bullet 6, we see that all types of abuse incidences, that all of the types, that threat of harm was most frequently identified, followed by neglect. Bullet 7 shows that parent, caregiver, alcohol, or drug use presented as the most common stress factor when child abuse was present. And bullet 8 shows us that 2 stressors that follow alcohol and drug use, which are domestic violence and involvement with law enforcement. Now let's remember the slide with the tree and the list of traumatic experiences. Within that list and tree, abuse, neglect, substance abuse, and domestic violence were all listed. Here the picture gets painted even a bit more clearly as we see the different incidences of abuse from 2021. Again, we notice that threat of harm was the largest, with neglect following. Then physical abuse following that, and sexual abuse shortly thereafter. And when we think about the definition of trauma, where an individual is facing threat that could lead to a life or death scenario, and we see that almost 47% of victims have experienced threat of harm, we can see that individuals who are involved in the Oregon Department of Human Services system are absolutely individuals that have experienced trauma, as these are all exceptional experiences in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a child's capacity to cope. It dysregulates their nervous system, causing a one-time traumatic event or traumatic events due to multiple events over time. We'll learn more about dysregulation and what that means in a later video. When we think about different types of trauma, there was a major research study that helped us better understand trauma and adverse childhood experiences. This was a study that showed that over 2/3 of individuals surveyed had been impacted by some sort of trauma or adverse childhood experience before the age of 18. This study used a survey that consisted of 10 questions. Each of these 10 questions represented one trauma or adverse childhood experience. When an individual completed the survey, they would add up the number of experiences out of the 10 listed that they had had before the age of 18. This became their ACE score. This ACE score then helped collect baseline data around measures like behavior and health outcomes, which we will look at. On the screen, you can see a chart with 3 columns. The first is a list of experiences. The second is what was reported in the ACE survey. And the third is what we know about Oregon. The data from Oregon comes from a student health survey that students under the age of 18 have the option to participate in at school. The most recent data we have is from 2020. We saw that Oregon is lower when it comes to parental separation or divorce, although this number comes from the Oregon divorce rate, so it does not include parental separation. It just shows divorces that have occurred. We can see that students in Oregon are reporting abuse, which is higher than what we saw in the ACE study. We are also seeing that students are reporting more instances of household mental illness than what was seen in the ACE study. The last three rows do not directly correlate with specific questions asked in the ACE study because we don't specifically ask students questions like, are you being emotionally neglected or physically neglected? Instead, we ask them, are you getting enough to eat? And have you had to wear dirty clothes? Which would correlate with emotional neglect, that question within the ACE study. You can see that the numbers in Oregon are higher than what the ACE study data is. Students are also reporting higher rates of feeling like they have no one to protect them, which aligns with the physical neglect questions in the ACE study. The conditions that we are looking at in this chart are conditions that can lead children and families to enter the child welfare system. The families we serve. We are going to discuss 3 types of stress. Stress is a natural part of life, and stress can impact how we behave. The families you will be working with are under high levels of stress for lots of different reasons. But before we talk about that, we should have a common definition of stress. This information comes from Harvard Center for the Developing Child, and they have done extensive research on how stress impacts individuals. They have identified 3 types of stress. Stress can be positive, it can be tolerable, or it can be toxic. Positive stress is normal, and it's an essential part of healthy development. Healthy stress motivates us to get things done and pushes us to try new things. It's characterized by brief increases in heart rate, mild elevation of hormone levels, and some situations that might trigger a positive stress response are the first day with a new caregiver, or receiving an immunization, or moving to a new place, or going to an interview for a new job. Those things might create positive stress. Tolerable stress is a stress response that is activated in the body when there is a serious negative event. This level of stress is usually a temporary stress response and is buffered by a supportive relationship. Losing a loved one, a natural disaster, or a frightening injury could trigger high levels of stress activation. But the reason these stresses don't turn toxic is because there's an individual there who is a supportive, nurturing, healthy relationship, helping get the individual through that time. This relationship buffers the impact of the stress, making the stress more tolerable. Toxic stress is the prolonged activation of stress. Toxic stress creates trauma because there is an absence of a protective relationship. An individual feels like they are isolated and having to figure things out on their own, which brings feelings of overwhelm. If there is no one to talk to and to buffer the impact of the stress, this creates a prolonged activation of stress in the body. Toxic stress can come from physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, caregiver substance abuse, mental illness, exposure to violence, burdens a family might encounter due to economic hardship, and without adequate adult support and all the types of trauma we looked at on the slide that we reviewed with the tree can lead to toxic stress. Let's now revisit some data from the Department of Human Services Child Welfare Data Report that came out in 2021. Here we are looking at the leading family stress factors of abused children. This data shows us the difference in how stressful each factor was from the year 2020 to the year 2021. We can see that parent and caregiver substance abuse is the highest stress factor that has been found across the board for a couple of years. Domestic violence comes next. Then we see parent caregiver involvement in a couple of ways, such as LEA, which stands for Law Enforcement Agency, mental illness, which aligns with the data points we looked at before. And overarchingly, this data helps us understand that this is not an easy road for individuals that you're working with. And oftentimes they feel like they have a lot of things working against them. Understanding these different types of stress and stressors will allow you to better understand the experiences of the families you are serving. As we look at these data points and understand the stressors of the families we work with, we might find ourselves making some assumptions or judgments. Let's take a minute to use this time to apply a lens of equity. Before we do that, we will review a couple of terms. The first term is power. Power is the ability to influence and make decisions that impact others. Power can also be used positively or can be used negatively. Think about the position you are in as a family partner. You are going to be seen as being in a position of power. This is because you will be providing feedback about how the individuals you are serving to the Department of Human Services Child Welfare. Being aware of this position is really important. How you build trust and transparency with these families is going to really have an impact on how safe they feel, how much they trust you, and how empowered they feel around you. The next term is privilege. Privilege is the advantages and benefits that individuals receive because of social groups that they perceive to be a part of. Privilege is often the result of systematic targeting or marginalization of other social groups. Consider if you're in a position of privilege as a family partner. You may already be considered to be in a position of privilege for lots of reasons, and being able to explore and understand that is an important part of being prepared in your role as a family partner. The last term is implicit bias. Implicit bias is the unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that shape our responses to certain groups, especially around race, class, and language. Implicit bias operates involuntarily, often without one's awareness or intentional control. Implicit bias is not implicit racism. So let's explore this a little more. We all have a set of knee-jerk reactions to experiences or circumstances, especially when thinking why a child was abused or beliefs around why a parent might have become involved in the child welfare system, right? Or thinking about some of the family stressors that we looked at may have elicited a response in your body or mind where you instantly made an assumption or you felt yourself tensing up. Maybe you found yourself with thoughts about that stressor running through your head. These things likely are the first things that pop into your brain. These thoughts are judgments and may not be based in fact or truth. Take a minute and ask yourself, where does that come from? Why is this unconscious attitude or this unconscious stereotype just popping into my mind? Is it because I heard this or I read this somewhere? Is it something that was passed on to me from someone I grew up with? And if you explore why you're having these thoughts, you can ask yourself, is this still true for me to believe? And what facts and truth can support this thinking? Implicit bias could have been developed to help keep us safe at one point in our lives. Yet being able to explore why we feel the way we feel about certain things can help us determine if that thinking needs to be reassessed and adjusted. For instance, if we see someone who is homeless, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you see that individual? And then ask yourself, why is that what I think of? Self-awareness and reflection is going to be a critical component of being in the role of a family partner, while also acknowledging that you might not always get all the answers to your questions or family history. So treating families that you work with fairness and compassion is key to your role, along with operating with an equity lens. Now, having a better understanding of these three terms, we can consider the cultures of those that you are serving and the different levels of culture. There are different levels of culture that influence what people believe and how they behave. This goes for all individuals. Individuals who are Hispanic, Native American, Caucasian, African American, Pacific Islander, we all have different levels of culture. Let's look at this image on the screen and start with the first level represented by the leaves on the tree. This is called the surface level of culture. And we see the leaves on the tree first because they stand out the most and they are most noticeable. That is the same. Oh, these are also the pieces of culture that have a very low emotional charge to them. Examples are what kind of music we love, what kind of food we enjoy, the way we dress, what holidays we celebrate. Those are all things that people can typically observe and might use these observations to make assumptions or judgments based on surface level culture. Yet, shallow and deep culture is much more important to understand when we are working with families in their home setting. Understanding how they communicate, understanding their unspoken rules and social norms around personal space and eye contact, understanding their worldview, their core beliefs, understanding how people behave within their culture and how they value different funds of knowledge, such as putting more emphasis on experiences versus being able to read and write. Keep in mind, you will be entering the homes and spaces of families, and you will be in a position of power. It is very important to limit your judgment and check your bias. And to do this, you will need to know what your own levels of culture are. It might be that your personal levels of culture do not match up with the individuals you are working with. And this is where being aware of your power, privilege, and bias come into play. This will help you become more culturally aware. In summary, understanding the idea of trauma-informed care and equity is important as you become a family partner. It will allow you to approach families with compassion, understanding, and cultural sensitivity. As you work to support parents and/or caregivers so they can provide safe and healthy environments where their children can grow and thrive. Thank you for your time today as you moved through this video. Please let your contact at Safe at Home know if you have any further questions, and be sure to check out the suggested videos to learn more about the topics discussed with you. We will see you in part 2 of Becoming Trauma Informed.